This is the keynote lecture. This is the last session of the day. We're joined by Paul Morillas, who's the director of CEDOB, which is the Barcelona Centre for International Affairs. He's a political scientist. He holds a PhD in politics, policies and international relations from the UAB and a master's with distinction in international relations from the LSE. And he's taught in several universities. He's also a member of the board of Cercle d'Economia and of eBay's European Foreign Policy Observatory. Previously, he was coordinator of the Political and Security Committee of the Council of the EU, advisor on external action at the European Parliament, and head of the Euro-Mediterranean policies field at the European Institute on the Mediterranean. He's published numerous articles in academic journals, think tanks, and opinion pieces on global geopolitics, European foreign policy, and European integration, among other topics. His latest book is Strategy Making in the EU, From Foreign Policy and Security Policy to External Action, from Palgrave Macmillan, 2019, and he has co-directed the documentary Bouncing Back, World Politics After the Pandemic in 2021, which proposes a reflection on the dynamics of conflict and opportunities for international cooperation in the post-COVID-19 world. He's going to talk today to us for 30 minutes on the topic of European crises, with time for questions and answers afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over. And the microphone is on and working. So if you would.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and participate in your conference, and in the framework of something that I used to do a lot, which is attending academic conferences. Now not so much, but I was very happy when I received the invitation to reflect a bit on the topic of your UACES conference on rebuilding Europe after a decade of crisis, or after the many poly-crises that are affecting the European Union. And I was thinking when I got the invitation how to approach this. Of course, there's always a temptation to either go through the different crises that the European Union has suffered and evaluate the response of the European Union to those crises on the one hand, or on the other, there's also the temptation to check all these crises against the frameworks that European theories and European academic discussions have been referring to in the last years. But I decided to do none of both, actually, and approach it in a different manner, approach the topic under discussion from a more strategic perspective, and try to reflect a bit with you, and perhaps in the Q&A session afterwards, to what extent this decade of crisis, as you name it in the conference, is actually forcing the European Union to be a different sort of international actor in light of those crises, and thus reflect on the very role that the European Union has as a political project, right? And that was a bit the approach that I took when preparing for this presentation. I'll do some preliminary remarks on how I think, and that will be arbitrary necessarily, on how I think that world politics is actually in the midst of a deep transition, and how that fully interacts with the way that the European Union conceives itself and interacts with the rest of the actors. Then I'll just make a few comments on the state of European poly-crisis. How has the European Union overall reacted to this last decade or more of crisis? And then I'll make a final few remarks on what I think. I won't have any slides, so it's just basically a lecture in itself. So I'll make a few remarks only in terms of the strategic choices that the European Union is faced with, right? And these strategic choices perhaps will end up defining eventually to what extent the European Union can be considered as having overcome this decade of crisis, and how these crises have transformed the European Union. So in a nutshell, the main strategic reflection is still to be made according to these choices that I will put forward. So let me first say a few words on the landscape, on the state of play in global affairs that I think interacts very much with the way the European Union perceives itself as a global actor. As I said, first remark that is probably shared by all of you is this feeling of transition in world politics, right? This old idea that we are moving from one sort of political, social, economic dynamics at the global scale and transitioning to a new one that is rapidly taking shape but not yet clearly defined in terms of the boundaries of how world politics will be in a few years to come. And of course that relates to, first and foremost, to the geopolitical transformations which are taking place today. The most studied one and the clearest one, of course, is the shift of power, right? And all those who have or who come from the sort of realist school of thought within IR will certainly find evidence for this shift of power from the West to the East and also among particular countries that is making all sort of power relations be rebalanced in military terms, in political terms, in economic terms, in social terms, in all the aspects that, in technological terms, in all the aspects that you want to refer to. But that power transition in itself is not something new. We've seen power transitions before with different outcomes when it comes to the conflict that emanates from power transition or to more cooperative dynamics that emanate from power transition. So that is a fact, but not necessarily a defining factor of how this world will look like in the years to come. Something that is more problematic is that this power transition is happening in the midst of a general understanding that geopolitical confrontation will be the main feature of global politics in the future. Geopolitical confrontation basically along the lines of more nationalist foreign policies, more what's in for me in this changing global order in terms of the national interests, and of course based on great power rivalry that is taking place amongst the most prominent actors of this geopolitical confrontation. Not only, also middle-sized powers are trying to gain increasing influence in these more multipolar or these more confrontational dynamics that I mentioned. So think about Turkey, think about Saudi Arabia, think about Indonesia, think about many countries that are also trying to play a greater role beyond what comes to mind as US, China, Russia, and the big powers that you might think of. Third aspect that I think is important is that all these geopolitical transformations and all this geopolitical confrontation is happening in the midst of the worst crisis of global governance structures that we have witnessed for the last decades. Basically, all the big multilateral organizations are in crisis. They are either ineffective because their purposes cannot be fulfilled because the countries that are part of them do not want them to succeed, on the one hand, or because their mandates have become obsolete when compared to the power dynamics that take place within these organizations, or because the challenges are way different than what they were designed for, right? So think about the World Health Organization in the midst of the pandemic and the rivalry between China and the US on who's to blame for the COVID crisis. Think about the World Trade Organization and the failure of the dispute mechanism to be solved precisely because of the blockage that the United States and China are recurrently putting on the organization. Think about the UN Security Council basically not having any pronunciation beyond the statement of the presidency saying that the concern is grave on the Ukraine war, but nothing else beyond that when it comes to peace and security matters. That is actually the main objective of the UN Security Council. And you could think about many other organizations that overall embody this crisis of global governance. And finally, within these geopolitical transformations, a certain sense of a crisis of the global liberal order, the crisis that those who were in charge of defining not necessarily the norms and the charter of the UN, but actually implementing it in a certain mental framework, well, is leading to other sort of understandings of what those values should be, what those political understanding of international cooperation should be about. In other words, basically the idea that geopolitics is trumping economics, geopolitics is trumping global politics in a general sense. So all this world that is ahead of us is complemented by something that we tend to look less at from the international relations perspective, but I think is as important as these geopolitical transformations, and that is the fragmentation of our societies. We live in a moment where our Western societies overall are living through loss of social capital, crisis of intermediaries, and at the end of the day, less certainty about who do we interact with if we want to start defining the basis of these geopolitical transformations, of this new global order that will come? Political parties are in deep crisis. They are less representative to the political discussions that are going on in many societies. The press has lost appeal to many of the citizens. Even think tanks, as my own think tank, tend to have a hard time in actually being able to interact with politics and to define the shape of the discussion, right? Because there are many voices that are also influencing those discussions. That, coupled with the loss of the social fabric and the individualization of societies, is certainly making the feeling among citizens that they are basically out there without no one really being able to take care of their daily concerns, which actually exist when it comes to the energy crisis and the rising prices of energy, when it comes to the rising prices of food, when it comes in Barcelona as well, but in many other places, on the rising prices of the houses that citizens live in, right? So all these dimensions of crisis do have an international feature, do have an international origin, but the intermediaries, if you like, or the political bodies and actors who should be in charge of giving a response to those concerns are unable, because they do not have enough capacities, do not have enough influence on these dynamics to make things change. So this is leading to this certain sense of political unease, political fragmentation, political despair among citizens that eventually, and that is another feature, leads to higher politicization of things that are present in the political agenda, higher salience of certain issues, migration, climate, social protection and social benefits, security, things that are increasingly being politicized and increasingly being polarized in the political discourse. And one side of the story is necessarily the rise of populism and the demise in the understanding that the traditional actors will be able to solve these things, right? There should be actors whom we can trust to put forward policies that can actually lead to better lives. This is dismantling in our societies as we speak. The worst scenario for that is a stark decrease of belief in democracy among young population in particular, a stark decrease in the number of freedoms, or the freedoms that are in countries that are diminishing for the first time, more in countries that where there are more diminishing sort of democratic values and human rights and rule of law than progress is being made on those areas, right? So a certain sense that our way of thinking and way of interacting is also in crisis. So add these two factors, the factors of geopolitical transformation plus the fragmentation of our societies, and you are facing a Europe, a decade of European politics characterized by the impact of crisis, right? Because the crises do not happen in a void or in a vacuum. They happen against this backdrop that I was mentioning until now. So, in a sense, the response of the European Union to certain to the number of crises that we have been going through in the last decade can be assessed positively in the short term, and I'll go a bit more into detail into how can it be assessed as a success in a certain sense. But overall, before actually looking at whether the response of the European Union to Brexit or to the pandemic or to the Ukraine war today is a success in itself, one can certainly ask whether it is not a bigger phenomenon of questioning our own model, European model of understanding continental politics that is put in a severe test in all these years of crisis. Well, first of all, because I think that the idea that fostering interdependence, fostering economic and social relations among Europeans and beyond Europeans is necessarily going to lead to better political relations is not actually what's ruling the world that we live in, right? The idea of the European Union as a political community that fosters good relations and that will eventually be copied in other parts of the world as a success model is clearly being questioned around the world. Actually, because more peaceful relations are not necessarily emerging. Think about the war in Ukraine, but think about Ethiopia as well. Do not only think about what's going on or what's in the front pages every day, but also because the interdependencies are actually becoming increasingly weaponized, right? There where interdependence would lead to peaceful relations, well, today it so happens that interdependence can also be weaponized when it comes to bombing Nord Stream 1 or when it comes to using technology as a way to spread fake news and disinformation, right? So all these are the idea that a more interdependent world is not necessarily a safer world. It's also a world where the tools of for confrontation are also more interdependent, and thus this feeling that the crises are interrelated. Second, this idea that the European Union, beyond believing strongly in economic interdependence, in political peaceful relations as a consequence of this, is also moving beyond the postmodern identity that it had been building for many years. One can say that the European Union has built a postmodern identity because it didn't have any alternative to build an identity in itself. It could not be the United States of Europe, so of course it could not interact in the same way with other powers as the United States do. It will never become a Chinese power either, right? It has different model, it has total different understanding of world politics. So by default, the European Union, and particularly on foreign policy matters, on international relations, had to build a narrative for itself. It has to justify that what it was doing in world politics was a different way of understanding power dynamics. It was a postmodern identity, a postmodern actor. It was a cosmopolitan actor. It was a normative power, right? All these ideas that more or less go along the same lines of saying Europe is different. It is different to the basic principles of international affairs. It is different from the core aspect that sovereignty plays in world politics. It is different than geopolitical rivalry and state interest to drive foreign policies. The European Union has built a narrative that has accommodated it well for many decades, because it didn't want to play in the league of what other world actors were doing. And as a consequence of that, it was ill-equipped for some of the topics in the international agenda that today are so important. If security is a must, the European Union is poorly equipped to deal with security issues. If defense and defense expenditure and F-16s and other fighter jets and Leopard tanks and other sort of very tangible material aspects of defense are very important, the European Union, not speaking about all member states, but the European Union as a whole is poorly equipped to deal with those because it was a choice, a deliberate choice to leave that behind, or to at least build a different way of exercising power in the international scene. So it should be mentioned, of course, that despite this strategic or this narrative that the European Union has been building in the last few decades, it's quite remarkable that the European Union has actually had a remarkable success in dealing with the crisis, right? And you are all aware, and I won't go into detail, but of course, many taboos have been broken since Brexit until today. Less so in the economic crisis of the early 10s and the refugee crisis of the mid-10s, right? There, the performance was quite poor, and actually citizens do believe that the performance in the Euro crisis and the refugee crisis were quite poor. But when it comes to Brexit, to Ukraine, to the pandemic, the response has been remarkable. Why? Because for the first time, you have had the idea that joint political mechanisms could be put forward without responding to the nature of the beast question. What is the European Union? Is it a federal state, or is it something like an international organization? Well, there was no need to give a response to that very DNA sort of question. The proof was in the pudding. The proof was in the responses that the European Union was putting forward when it comes to the Next Generation EU, or when it comes to the use of the European Defence Fund to actually support, and the European Peace Facility to support Ukraine, right? By acting, the European Union was avoiding the response to treaty change, the response to federal union, the response, all those questions didn't necessarily need to be asked, but were actually answered by the sort of European Zeitenwende, as the Germans would put it, that is actually taking place as we speak. And that has coupled with changes that were unimaginable, right? How can you decouple from Russian gas if some countries depend 100% on Russian gas, or 95% on Russian gas? How can you do that in so little time? And how can you do that to actually change the total understanding of relations with Russia that you've had in the last few years? And not only had, actually fostered so the idea of going beyond what you had put in forward. So in a sense, also the discussion of the impact of populism and Euroscepticism has been put on hold, because citizens have not necessarily come together under the idea that the flag that better represents them is the European one instead of the French one. No, that has not been given an answer to. The answer has been given by this idea of being by doing, right? I mean, as long as you perform, as long as the European Union is useful for the needs of the citizens, or is devising new sort of politics and frameworks that serve the purpose of tackling those crises, so good, so far so good. I mean, no need to actually go beyond these sort of attitudes. And finally, something that is quite remarkable as well is that these mechanisms have been put together under a strong agreement between the member states and the Commission, right? For how long, and myself in my academic life, previous academic life, for how long we had been trying to answer to the question of, is it intergovernmentalism or is it supranationalism that actually defines what the European Union is, right? And that is a recurring debate, and you will find plenty of evidence for many of those ideas being the truth in European politics. Well, it so happens today that basically with Brexit, with the pandemic, with Ukraine, there has been strong leadership by member states and strong agreement on policies designed and devised by member states, and an actual confidence in the Commission as the best body to speak and do things on behalf of them all. And that is sort of breaking the idea that you need to define if the European Union is one thing or the other. Well, as long as there is this alignment between member states and the Commission, between the intergovernmental and the supranational, you can devise a Next Generation EU. You can put forward joint resources, and you can borrow money on the markets on behalf of the EU budget. You can actually design a scheme of vaccination for the whole of Europeans, where the Commission is actually buying those vaccines and distributing those vaccines. And you can actually use common resources for securing arms, securing weapons, to provide for a country that is actually in need for self-defense against the aggressor. No need to give a total, absolute answer to who is to decide those things. And that is quite remarkable. So to end on my remarks, let me put forward very schematically, after reviewing this framework that we live in, after reviewing the response of the European Union to the decade of crisis that I have just mentioned now, some of the strategic choices that need to be discussed, if not made, to make out of this experience, out of this decade of crisis experience, something that is long-lasting, something that actually builds this European Union for the future. The first idea is that at some point, internal reform needs to go beyond crisis management. It's good that you are able to respond to crisis, and that is probably the first objective of any political and public administration body, respond to the needs of the citizens. But it is so clear today that internal procedures within the European Union are avoiding these reforms because the urgencies are others. But this doesn't mean that at the time when we will have to take specific choices on the use of common resources, you will need to be better equipped in terms of the procedures that actually go in line with the fiscal rules or that go in line with what the European Commission can do on behalf of them all. So internal reform will need to be tackled at some point beyond, or at least when the crisis management mode has been some sort of overcome. Second, there is a big discussion still to be made between enlargement and deepening of the European Union to put forward or to consolidate the sort of actions that have been taken so far. You have the question of Ukraine's accession, of course, and Moldova's accession later on. That is forcing the European Union to reflect on its boundaries, to reflect on its conditionality mechanisms, to reflect on the thresholds that it has put forward for many decades as a foreign policy tool. But it also has the Western Balkans, where, remember, there are some countries on Kosovo that still do not recognize Kosovo as a country and thus make enlargement towards the Western Balkans incomplete. These things have been put aside, but at some point enlargement policy will need to be reflected upon. Third, we need to start thinking about whether the framework of strategic autonomy is fit for purpose or it is outdated. And when I say outdated, it's not only because Macron gives an interview in a plane coming back from China, which is probably also a good reason to think about strategic autonomy as an outdated framework, but also because something more is demanded from the European Union. The strategic autonomy formula is too much based on building capacities autonomous to other actors that actually the European Union will never be able to build, right? Or is not sufficiently equipped to build by itself. You will always have to have a certain sense of strategic responsibility in tackling certain aspects that do not necessarily align with being more autonomous. Yes, you need to be strategic. Yes, you need to have sovereign capacity to act on defense, on energy, on trade, on many things, but you have to be responsible when it comes to the challenges that are put ahead of you. And if we are changing the framework from strategic autonomy to strategic responsibility or strategic sovereignty, if you like, then you have to come to terms with the idea that many of the things that you do as a foreign policy actor do have an internal component. It is impossible that you speak about self-sufficiency in certain goods if you are still working on a national basis when it comes to the budgets that you can operate on. That is a question that the evidence is showing you that if you want to have some sort of consolidated next generation fund, call it as you wish, not necessarily next generation, whatever sort of fund that you have to have for the digital transition, for the green transition, or for the security transition, you need common funds. You need common capacity of not only having a 1% of the GDP available for common feature, but actually you need much more than that. And that links perfectly internal reforms with external politics. Fourth, you need to start reflecting on the need that it's not only that you need to spend more on defense, that be more active as a security actor, but actually that you need to integrate your defense expenditure. You need to start building clearly the idea of a defense union. It is absolutely useless that you reach the 2% goal target of defense expenditure across all countries if you still have 30 different systems for armed provisions, if you have 30 different systems for weapon supplies or for different sort of military components across the European countries. Defense expenditure per se is not a benchmark. What matters is whether you can use coherently and jointly these defense mechanisms for the sake of having more of a defense capacities in crisis, Ukraine or others. Fifth, you need to start clarifying, as Europeans, a division of labor between the different organizations that are being increasingly present in the European continent. Of course, NATO and the EU are becoming more aligned when it comes to the membership in both organizations, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Of course, EU and NATO have a lot of complementarity in defense and matters. So a better clarification between the division of labor between those two organizations will be necessary, but also a better clarification with how to engage with the European political community, for instance, which is taking shape as a forum for discussions on the state of European order, on the state of the European security architecture, and it is very unclear as of today how the European Union and the EPC interact in political and practical terms. Sixth, you need to have a better understanding of how you come to terms with the idea that the Global South is to be your new partner in many of the transitions that you will be developing. It is not plausible anymore that the relations with the Global South are still characterized by this sort of colonial mentality that the European Union has been approaching the rest of the countries around the earth, beyond, of course, the United States, China, and other big powers. It is not possible that if you want to engage with the Global South, you still have not come to terms with the idea that you are speaking more of an equal basis than as a former colonies vis-a-vis the former metropolis, as the way we have engaged in the last few years with the Global South. And finally, do not take populism for that in the years to come. The danger of populism is not interacting against only the response to the crisis that you have given. The populism attitudes and the political parties that benefit from more populist discourses are capitalizing on the exact first factors that I mentioned, are capitalizing on the individualization of our societies, on the fragmentation of our welfare systems, on our rising inequality, on the identity and cultural issues that are permeating the political discourse all the time, and on the changes of the global order that are taking shape as we speak. So perhaps we have put a parenthesis into the influence of populist party, or call them as you wish, in European politics. But that looming danger of populism is well ahead of us in the US election in 2024. It will be again with us in France once Macron ends his term. It will be ahead in the rising number of AfD supporters in Germany. It is among us today in the Vox party in Spain, right? So all these features are still there because they are not only some sort of complaining votes that emerge every now and then. Is because they capitalize on these deep social transformations, geopolitical transformations that I have put forward before. So I will leave it here. I'm happy to go into more detail if you like of some of the things, but I hope I clarified a bit the way I look at European politics from a sort of realist perspective on the things that have been done well and the things that are still to be done. Thank you.
See, here.
Oh, you've already got it. Oh, okay, great. Well, then we can take questions.
Okay. First of all, thank you for this amazing summary. That it was amazing. What I think, I have a question, but before that, what it reminds me when you talk about this, the whole world was thinking that they had a solution. They had a solution through 90s, right? After the end of the Cold War, liberalize your markets, build efficient institutions, open your country for interconnectedness, economicness, and then political freedom, wealth, the other issues will be there. And the EU emerged as this kind of actor, as a flag holder of this idea, institutional, not as a politically, but also institutionally. But this decade of crisis, now that ground is not there. Now we realize that, of course, it was efficient to produce something in China, but wow, there is a virus and the whole economy struggles now. So globalization part is not in there. So interdependence as a source of power. There is Putin, we know what's going on, and no, now it's not, we cannot exert power through interdependence. And then, of course, the economic crisis. Since we built this kind of order, now we institutionally not able to respond to the expectations of the citizens. It is not a surprise for me that the most reactive groups in the society to migrants, for example, is the low-skilled migrants, because they have to compete with them in the market. There is less state protection, housing crisis, and as a result, in the literature also, it is discussed that how main left parties and main right parties, they can only say the same things. They cannot differentiate themselves on how to deal with that. And of course, from left, from right, populist parties, they raise on just claiming for solutions for this kind of stuff. So, of course, institutional designs matters, how to rebuild it, it's matter. Of course, I agree that. But from my perspective, the real problem with the essence, the soul of the project. And I don't see that it is intensively discussed as we discuss what kind of institution, whether we need army, whether we have to this policy. It is institutionally designed for those periods. But now we are going to live in a different times. We need more protection, more state expenditure, maybe sometimes even inflation in this sense. So my question from this background, so do you think that, for example, more democracy, more power to the European Parliament would be an answer for this issue? Because, you know, there is this situation, like some scholars like Morillas, they think that if you democratize the EU, you undermine the whole project. It's a bad thing. And also, for example, from the Green Deal perspective, if it doesn't come from this kind of technocratic entity like the EU, I couldn't imagine that those states would be this responsive, take initiative about this crucial issue. But on the other hand, we need a discussion policy for the Europe, and we need to make them included, make the discussion over the soul of the EU in general included to that. So that's my question, and thank you for the presentation.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, great. You mentioned about the, European institutional mechanism should not learn from the crisis. It should be developed beyond the crisis management. But as far as I see, since now, it's always, European Union always got lessons learned after the crisis happened. What do you think about how we can solve this issue, first of all? Secondly, you mentioned about yes, nowadays it's a very trendy topic, even I'm interested in it, strategic autonomy. the base on the strategic autonomy, according to me, is based on the characteristics of the European Union strategic culture. Because there's an emerging European Union strategic culture. And for me, the problem is regarding to its characteristics, because it's always inclined to, the crisis management and, the substitute of somehow the NATO, because they think that NATO can do the military things. We can say the bad cop and good cop things. How we can solve the issue of the European Union strategic culture to solve the strategic autonomy? Because I think for the root is, I'm repeating myself, but this is the root causes that. I think for me, rather than focusing on the convergence of member states, maybe we could find some kind of upper or holistic perspective to strategic culture and to find the strategic autonomy. Yeah, I've said that. Thank you.
Mine is connected a lot with that, so maybe you can make it into one pretty answer. But yes, indeed, what you said about integration having to go beyond crises, in the end, the European project has always been an ambitious one in the sense that it is not often that member states are willing to let go of so much sovereignty to this higher organization. So indeed, is it not the nature of those kind of politics that it takes a crisis for them to be faced with an issue that they themselves cannot solve, to realize, okay, now I am willing to let go of my sovereign power into this organization that can solve it. So although I understand it in theory, how will we make these member states such as Germany and France be willing to go beyond us and not just do what is necessary in those situations?
Listen, on this last point, that is a totally relevant question and connected to the previous one. Well, it happens that with Ukraine, something that has changed the mindsets of political leaders is that actually you should integrate in an area that you have from the very start decided that you would never integrate within the European Union. And that is defense issues. Defense and security was part of NATO, first and foremost, and was part of member states' sovereign rights and not to be given to the European Union. The best you could do at the European level was to provide some sort of accompanying features on defense matters for reforming security services, security sectors in countries in conflict. You could reform the judiciary. You could do basically CSDP missions that would accompany other efforts, much more hard power efforts that other actors would do or that member states by themselves would do, right? The problem with Ukraine is that it has put forward the idea that if out of every crisis that you have lived so far, some more integration has followed, what do you do when this crisis tackles the only area that you have decided not to integrate? And the answer so far is only limited. The answer, if you ask the High Representative, is revolutionary because the European Peace Facility is a mechanism that was never thought about providing weapons, and it actually is providing weapons to Ukraine today, and that on his mindset is revolutionary, and I might agree with that. But the rest of the story is that every single surge in defense that has been done is not being built under a common framework. So you still have the same problems that you used to have before. PESCO, this permanent structural cooperation, eventually what has happened is that it's a lot of cooperation and not so much integration within PESCO. What you have is all the countries that in principle were doing reinforced cooperation on defense matters actually wanted to join the PESCO endeavor because no one wanted to be left behind, because otherwise a few countries would be taking decisions on defense matters that would actually impact on the rest of the members that were not part of PESCO. Solution to that, everyone joins PESCO. Solution to that as well is that you lower the ambitions of PESCO, of course, because you have to agree among many different voices, and you end up reproducing some sort of dynamics that that have been present in security and defense matters in the European Union. And linked to this, the question is whether for that integration to happen in defense matters, you need to respond first to the strategic question, and that links to what you were saying before. Do you need to have a joint strategic culture before you start thinking about jointly spending on defense, jointly integrating your armed forces? And here, if we wait for that to happen, we will probably see it in specific crises. I mean, one could have imagined perfectly that the war in Ukraine would have led to internal divisions, right? Because it's not only about the war in Ukraine, it's about how you relate with Russia. And relations with Russia have always been conflictual among the 27 or 28 member states at the times of Brexit, before Brexit, right? Because the relations with Russia were understood under very different premises from Madrid than Vilnius, right? I mean, that's normal. Geography matters for that matter. But the truth is that we didn't need to have this discussion. I mean, we understood that the aggression was grave enough as a crisis to give an answer to this and to act unitedly. Question is, how long can you pursue that strategic common position once the crisis or the war is entering a maturity phase? It's not being resolved, but it's a frozen conflict. How long can you adapt to that reality? And when will divergences start to emerge? Of course, Orban and Hungary is already putting forward some divergences vis-à-vis Russia, but it's only that divergence that is taking shape. So it's controllable, right? I mean, you can have Hungary angry at some point, but you basically end up doing the same things, no matter how Hungary and Orban puts forward different ideas. So probably the question on the strategic culture of the European Union is the most relevant one. And this leads me to my previous comments. If the strategic culture of the European Union had been built according to a different understanding of international politics and power, and that was the normative power, it was all the idea that the force for good, it was all that you mentioned before, can it adapt to a more geopolitical role, a more power-based global order, and so on? And here I am very skeptical. I am skeptical because I think that what we have been doing in the last 5 years on the side of the Commission, on the side of the High Representative, and I'm an advisor to him, so and I've told him that, I think that we have reproduced the classical capability expectations gap on this. As much as we have been saying we are a more geopolitical actor, we need to speak the language of power, we need all these forms that you have heard about, the truth is that we have been able to do it because we were in the midst of a crisis, but not because we have changed our strategic culture or not because we have integrated our armed forces. That would be a change in strategic culture. That would be a change in the way that the EU performs in global politics. This hasn't happened, and it's unlikely to happen because the divergences will re-emerge and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think that probably the way out of this will be some sort of reproduction of the way that the European Union has gone out of crisis. It's never by responding to the big question. It's always by performing tasks. It's always by doing things in a different manner. And I think that's the way the European Union works. I mean, to be honest, it's more realistic. It's underperforming, or you might say, well, it's not enough against the rise of China. It's not enough against the resurgent Russia. It's not enough, and I agree, or against the climate emergency looming ahead of us. It might not be enough, but probably it's the most realistic way. And I think that this is where we're at. And probably in a few years' time, we will need to go back and say, was the use of the European Peace Facility so groundbreaking, or was it conjunctural? Was it because we had a war in our borders and we had actually promised that country that would join the European Union, so we had to do something? And probably the end result will be contextual, will be on this basis. And also, because of NATO. right? I mean, you will never be able to diminish the gap that is widening among Atlanticism within the European Union, or pro-Atlantist countries and pro-integrationist countries. I think that this, as much as we have been able to close that gap after Ukraine by jointly acting and by having a joint response to the war in Ukraine, I don't think, to be honest, that you will ever convince a Pole or a Slovak or even a Finn that NATO is not more important than the European Union in defense matters. For as much as France keeps insisting that we need to have our own defense capabilities. Yes, we need to have them, but it will always be complementary to NATO. It will never be a substitute to NATO. And if that is the case, then probably the best the European Union can do in security and defense matters is this complementary role, this sort of enabling actor for discussions. And this is where the European political community comes in. Because the European political community will likely be the forum where biggest political discussions will be designed across the whole of the European continent, vis-à-vis Russia, but also perhaps other issues such as China. And that is where the European political community, it's an interesting development to follow if you want to have a sense of the broader political and geopolitical discussions. On democracy and whether we need to give more power to the supranational institutions and so on, I think that on that, again, it's very unlikely that we will end up resolving what the European Union is by giving more powers to the European Parliament. I mean, the European Parliament is already a very important forum for taking decisions on most of the legislation that is happening across Europe. It's already a very important actor. But every time we have tried to give the European Parliament more political salience, I think that we have always have to come to terms with the idea that the political guidance of the European Union is not happening in the European Parliament, it's happening in national capitals, it's happening in the Council, and the European Council in particular. Right? So this is where the big political impetus will emanate from in every subsequent crisis. Because as I said before, it has worked quite well. Because as long as there has been agreement in the European Council, the European Parliament has been looking at it and saying, okay, let's reinforce the role of the Commission and let's make the Commission a more powerful actor in European politics. Fine. It's worked well. It's not by deciding whether the Spitzenkandidaten formula needs to stick for the years to come. I could bet with you that on the next election of the European Parliament next year, most probably the Spitzenkandidaten formula will not be the first discussion among political leaders, will not be the solution to the reinforcement of democracy in Europe. Most probably the solution will be given to who is the better candidate that can secure that performance and the decisions that are taken are useful and are doing good. If that is through the Spitzenkandidaten process or through another democratic procedure that we can come up with, well, it's a bit irrelevant. And I think that basically what we have understood after this decade of crisis is that you needed a common vaccination. You didn't need political parties in Europe arguing whether a common vaccination procedure was necessary or was not necessary, whether the member states should do it by themselves or the European Commission had to do it by itself. I don't think that the political discussion in Europe needs to go along those lines. I think that the political discussion in Europe needs to go, fine, we have a pandemic. We cannot have the Portuguese vaccinated after the Germans, 3 months after the Germans, because that is the breakup of the European Union. Let's secure a way in which we can get joint vaccines. I think that is the learning process that we have had in European politics. It's not but by politicizing the access to vaccines that we will be reinforcing European democracy. I think that it will be by delivering results that we will make more progress. And that certainly means that in some areas We have to come to terms with the idea that some common institutions are better suited than national institutions. And that is the case. I mean, for many of the things that we have been doing in terms of crisis management in the last few years, and particularly since the pandemic. I think I covered many of the things that you mentioned. I think there was another question, yeah?
Thanks. So is it coming through clearly? Yeah, there we go. Cool. Thanks so much for that. That was really clear and really fascinating talk. I do want to return to the topic of democracy. I know you were sort of answering it just now, but I mean, I'm hearing a few things. So if we're talking about expanding the EU's capacities and talking about more powers essentially passing over to EU institutions as opposed to national institutions, and if the EU Parliament is not a solution for increasing democracy in the EU, and if there's this idea that really, well, there's just more and more integration and more problems being solved by the EU and not by national parliaments. I mean, you spoke also about this sort of risk of populism. Another way of looking at it be that the EU in that case represents a threat to democracy? It's increasingly de-democratizing Europe in some sense.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Excellent question. Yeah?
It's connected, so maybe I can share it as well. I find it interesting that people always say the European Parliament is a very important actor, and then they immediately sort of debunk their own statements. So I sometimes feel maybe we're so scared to say it's not important because it sounds very undemocratic, but by creating this organ and then not really giving it a lot of relevance, is that just even more dishonest? Wouldn't it be better to just say we are a supranational organization? The European Parliament, we created it because we wanted to give it this democratic check almost, look, it's there now it's fine.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it not be more honest to just sort of be like, we're many member states having to work together, which works better on a smaller scale in smaller institutions like the Council, like the Commission.
Yeah.
I sometimes feel like maybe the people would appreciate that more than creating this parliament and making them go vote for it and nobody really knows what it does and what impact it has. So just connecting, maybe it's not a bad thing to make less democratization of the European Union because it would at least be more honest or more transparent about it that way. So just some thoughts.
Yeah. No, it's a very relevant point. I mean, you're both making very good points here. But two things. You have not been giving the European Parliament more democratic power, but you have been giving the European Parliament much more power, full stop. I mean, the Parliament is involved in every single decision in the co-decision practice, and that amounts to 80–90% of most of the work that the European Union does on an equal footing with the Council. Right? So it's not by, again, giving an answer, a definite answer where the democratic values or body of the European Union lies. It's actually because the treaties have said that it lies there, full stop. And you are co-deciding on many of the issues with the European Parliament. So it has powers. It's not an irrelevant institution. What I am questioning myself is whether the European Parliament is the representation of democracy in Europe. Right? And that's a different thing. Because the representation of democracy in Europe is also in the Council. Because in the Council, you have elected officials who are acting on behalf of their governments and doing their policies according to what voters have said. So it's a secondary way to legitimizing decisions at the European Union level. It's not directly elected, but it is elected nonetheless. And probably the European Union, what is sort of coming to terms with, is how do you make democracy more powerful by delegated powers, or do you make democracy more powerful by electing officials directly? And this is the big question. I mean, where does democracy lie? Does it lie in the European Parliament? Does it lie in the Council? And both are democratic bodies, though differently elected, embodying different understandings of democracy. The big question that you were asking is then, and I fully agree with that, with the point that you were making, is, okay, fine, but then if we are giving more powers, shouldn't we also be democratizing more these powers that we are, or these bodies that embody the power that we are giving them? And that is a very fair point. It's a very fair point. I'm not sure the link with giving more powers to the European Parliament as a way to overcome the populist demands or the populist discourse. Yeah, go ahead.
I suppose for me the concern is not necessarily around the European Parliament specifically. It's that if that's not a solution and there's no other solution being proposed, then in some sense the populists are correct that the EU is an anti-democratic institution.
Yes, but fine. But let me give you a very non-academic answer to this.
Yeah, of course.
I mean,
perfect, yeah.
do you really know what the city council of your of the place you live in, I don't know where you live, actually does, is elected? Who's your representative? Who does exactly what? To what extent can you go and ask? I mean, you don't know for many of the public bodies that you interact with.
Yeah, sure. I think that municipalism would be great for more people to be more involved in. I mean, increased democratic participation.
Yeah, and that would bring you democracy closer to home. But it would not necessarily make you perform democracy better if the municipalities or cities had more powers. The only thing is that they're closer to you. And that I agree. But what I'm not buying is the argument that since the European Parliament is not, or the Commission, or whomever you want to talk about at the European level, is not perfectly democratic, then we have to say yes to the populist critique. No, because it's actually working. It's actually working for the purposes that they have been given. And it's a different sort of democratic credential, that one.
I think I have more thoughts, but I think I better pass to someone else.
Just to add on and connect it to the topic on political participation, because I mean the populists are the few loud ones, but many people that are also present among the electorates are those that are disenfranchised, that may also be make everything more moderate, but they're just disinterested in politics. And that goes back to the idea, by not really involving the people into the process, then we're making them more disinterested and less feeling powerful. So again, by providing this kind of solution, then we're creating a negative externality again. So I'm kind of puzzled by that. Yeah,
but that's a whole discussion about where does legitimacy come from, right? Is it input or output that matters most? And I think that the European Union has shown that output legitimacy has been important after a decade of crisis. It doesn't mean that it has become more democratic. No, it means that it has served the purpose of many Europeans in the last decades, particularly if you compare the figures of the Eurobarometer in 2016 until today. What you see is more sort of support for a European Union that works, a European Union that responds to the crisis. So my question is, since we will never be able to solve the big D democratic discussion at the European Union level, has the emphasis, or needs the emphasis to be put on reinforcing the European Parliament, electing directly, or Macron's idea about citizen consultations and so on? Will this give you a better answer to the democratic deficit than a union that works? This is my question. I'm not answering to the question. I'm putting forward the question and the idea. And to be honest, on many of the political discussions that we are having in Barcelona, in Madrid, in Spain, or in any sort of government, what people are asking as well is also effectiveness of the policies that are being put forward, effectiveness when it comes to responding to the rise of energy prices. What do you do with that? I mean, how do you devise a European solution to cap the price of energy, and that is a way to basically overcome the worst effect of the crisis? Is that what citizens are demanding? Or are they concerned that this decision of the energy cap prices at the European Commission was taken without full democratic acknowledgement of the powers that the European Commission had on this? I mean, to be honest, for me, it's more the first than the second. We're not solving the problem here. We're not solving the problem. We are asking ourselves whether the European Union has been more successful as a political project or has been more successful as a crisis manager. These are two different questions. That was my point.
And in this respect, a slight comment. I think that the way in which you define legitimacy of outcomes is actually copying the rationality of the founding communities. Mm-hmm. Let's make it work and discuss afterwards. Mm-hmm. Is it right?
In a certain sense, I agree with you. I agree with you. One aspect that I think that needs to be put forward as well, and that we haven't mentioned much, but it's important as well, is whether that method is still working in the information age, in the social media age. And probably that method worked well when scrutiny was much lower. You could have Helmut Kohl and Mitterrand and Felipe González going to Brussels and discussing in Brussels what the solution to the given crisis would be at that moment, and the newspapers in Spain, France, and Germany wouldn't say a word about that. So their level of decision-taking capacity without public scrutiny was much higher at those times than today. And that is true. The way the job of a politician today is much more difficult, because every decision that is taken in Brussels, of course, you need to look back and say, okay, how is this being reflected in the national press, in the social media, and so on and so forth. This has changed dramatically, and I agree with that. So is it possible to continue with this undemocratic way of proceeding as long as you give responses to the needs of the citizens? Recent crises show me that this is important. Is it the definitive answer? I will never be able to give you the definitive answer to that question, right? But because the scrutiny has, and we haven't mentioned that, and we haven't mentioned the way that politicians are acting in Brussels today, and the number of times that they go to Brussels to take decisions, of course, is uncomparable to the number of times and the scrutiny that they were getting back in time when taking those decisions. You had another comment.
Yeah, I know.
Do you mind if I
just
jump in for just a second? I was struck by your comments on the international organizations that are in crisis. So you mentioned, for example, the WTO. And I was thinking about some of the other organizations that seem to be doing at least slightly better. So you have the Conference on Parties for Climate that seems to be doing reasonably well, though maybe not moving quite as quickly as some people might hope. And then obviously there's new enthusiasm for NATO. I wonder, how do you see the changing institutional makeup in supranational organizations? Do you see those changing in terms of responding to new crises or new challenges, and simply the old ones are fading away, or do you think that the old ones need to be fixed as well?
No, that's very difficult to answer as well. I'm a bit more cautious with the good results of COPs, to be honest, because I think that yes, agreements are reached, but then implementation doesn't follow because they're not binding at the end of the day. So it's good that an agreement is reached. It's good that we add new criteria, new benchmarks to fight the climate crisis. But then, of course, if implementation doesn't follow, that's only half of the story. Of course, it's even worse if you do not agree within the framework of COP. What are the next steps to be taken? Of course, that is a poor result, much poorer than the one we have. Is it enough? I'm a bit, I mean, as long as you put forward a fund that has to be, damage, I can't remember the name because I'm not an expert on climate, but the loss and repair damage or fund or something like that. No, I mean, you agree that you will put forward that fund, but after that, no money is put into the fund, then fine, you created the fund, but or the idea that you could have a fund, but is it operational? No. Then I'm a bit skeptical. On NATO, the reinforcement of NATO, I agree that there has been some sort of new impetus for the organization, and that I agree. First and foremost, because it has been confronted to the classical threat, right? So the very purpose for which NATO exists has been reinforced, right? And that creates some new sets of momentum. It's not brain dead anymore, right? So perhaps that is clearly the case. But with NATO, you'd better not use it. That's the thing. I mean, it's a security guarantee. It's not an organization, and of course it's a deterrence organization, so it serves many purposes. I'm not saying that it's useless, no. It serves many purposes, but you wish you will never have to press Article 5 button, right? That's the idea of it. That's why it's working as well. It's totally different than what the World Health Organization is made for, the World Trade Organization is made for, or the COP, or Conference of the Parties, is made for, which is actually tackling problems that are there and that for which you need action. On those organizations, or the UN Security Council, on those organizations, I'm more skeptical. On NATO, I agree with you that it has had more of a role. Yeah, I think more.
I think it's probably a bit unfair, but it was we sort of had the conference. We deliberately put rebuilding Europe after a crisis because we didn't want to be too pessimistic. So
it's fine. And it's fine.
It would be unfair just to invite you here and talk about crisis and then say, but maybe we should be more optimistic, But I think it's a fair analysis. It was just maybe
but also
almost devil's advocate or something, to ask the opposite. Yeah.
No, and I commend you for being more optimist. But the truth is, I mean, then at some point you will need to start the other thing that you asked, which is how do you reform those institutions, right? And how do you make them more inclusive, more efficient, more according to the world that exists there, without necessarily going into a world war again to build new organizations. Of course, that's what you want to avoid, right? The reform of those organizations, to be honest, on the UN Security Council, and I've written papers about this, it's not due to a shortage of ideas. It's basically due to a shortage of political will, and that is really the case. I mean, you could devise so many formulas for overcoming the power of the P5 and the veto right of the P5 by doing it. More inclusive, by removing veto rights into only essential national interests invoked as a way to use your right to veto. There are so many ideas floating around for the last many years about how to reform the UN Security Council, and none has actually worked, that it's not because the ideas are not there. It's just because tell the French that they need to give their seat to the European Union instead of keeping it for themselves at the UN Security Council, and it's not happening.
So we have 10 minutes, so I think we have time for at least one more question, if anybody does have. Did you want to come in on something?
If somebody else wants, I've already spoken on.
But you're more than welcome, I think, because there's more takers.
No, it's about what you said earlier as well about efficiency, that in the end is the end goal. I think, then again, I don't want to be negative again because you want it to become positive, but can we really say that I do think that's also another big critique that populists or the people in general, if we can say that, is that the European Union is definitely not being its most efficient in using its funds to organize itself. Which then again comes to, you have this, the Commission, just a brief overview if people don't know this, the Commission comes with a proposal and then the act gets discussed in the Council and Parliament at the same time, and they have to agree on this. So there's a lot of critique about all these extra funds that go to these two organs who in the end, especially if then you have a Parliament which is going to follow what the Council is telling them to do, is unnecessarily. And then if you mix that up with France, who has a Parliament in Strasbourg and they have to travel there 5 days a week, so then if you do say that in Europe in the end, the end goal is to create efficient legislation that can be implemented, shouldn't we also look inwards and become more efficient in ourselves? Because I feel like this critique is, we've been saying it for a long time, but nothing's really changing. So does that then come back to the political will? And
Yeah, but the magnitude of the problem is not as big as it seems in the headlines. I mean, again, the Barcelona City Council has as many officials and workers as the whole of the European Commission, right? I mean, in numbers. Of course, the European Commission wants get better salaries than the ones at the Barcelona City Council, but the infrastructure of the Barcelona City Council and of the European Commission in size is exactly the same. So we also need to give that answer to those who say, no, they're only spending money and doing nothing. No, it doesn't mean that because you don't know what they are doing, that they are doing nothing. It's just because you don't know what they are doing. So the problem is also on you being critical against the European Parliament if you don't know what the European Parliament is about, right? So we better get some more education in a sense of why this institution is important, and we need to convey the message that is important. That said, there are plenty of ways to make them more efficient. I'm sorry, the Strasbourg thing, it's about a few restaurants and hotels putting pressure on the French government. And I'm sorry, but that's about it. I've lived in Strasbourg. I know what Strasbourg is about. I've traveled to Strasbourg. I lived in Brussels, but I traveled to Strasbourg for every plenary. And it's about that. It's really about that. Of course, you need to make a compensation for Strasbourg and so on and so forth. But to be honest, this is a question that French politicians can solve. Can solve because it's not such a big deal. There are many proposals. You can put a museum there, you can put another institution there, you can make, the EPC can go there if you like, if you give it a secretariat, put it in Strasbourg, right? And Macron will be very happy with that. So there are ways to solve that. So on that, I give credit to those who say, well, there's a lack of political will to confront this because you don't need to. You don't need two parliaments, and I will be the first. And every time you put forward that sort of thinking, well, it's more complex than it seems. Yes, it's more complex than it seems, but it's very simple. You need to be more efficient at that. Would that solve all the problems that populists? No, it would just remove one of the banners that they use for their political discourse. So that's not also the panacea in terms of the solution that you can give. But I'm with you. Let's do it.
Should we do something about that? That indeed this is just a very specific situation, but that a country such as France can block this decision that is costing a lot of money for some economic, and Germany for some economic reasons. Like, how could we reform the union to prevent this from happening?
Well, that's the whole discussion about unanimity, right? That's the whole discussion. And again, I've been in many focus groups and many discussions with politicians and European policymakers on unanimity. And again, the discussions all the way go along the same lines. Well, it's not the panacea to remove the unanimity rule for European politics, for the most important decisions in European politics. And I agree, it's not the end solution. It's not the only way that you can confront these criticisms. But it's a way forward. Let's be honest. If you need to adopt all these decisions by unanimity, you know for sure that you will have to spend 3 extra days getting to a suboptimal solution. Is QMV the only way to take decisions? No, perhaps, but we could flexibilize a bit the use of unanimity. Is treaty reform needed by unanimity? Yes, probably yes. You need to have a treaty adopted by unanimity. That's why no one wants to open the Pandora box of the treaty change today, right? I mean, yes, I agree. Some big decisions need to be taken by unanimity. To be honest, is the increase, and I'm being I'm not saying the full truth, but in any case, is the increase of 5 to 10,000 personnel in a given CSDP mission or operation the right way, or the right decision needs to be taken by unanimity? To be honest, I don't think so. I don't think so. For the treaty change, yes. For the increase of personnel in a CSDP mission that has already been approved and that has the green light by all the member states to be implemented and so on, does it need to be decided by unanimity? I don't think so. So there are many gray areas within the unanimity discussion, and also on the battle groups as well. I mean, you have them in the treaties. You have the political agreement to put them in force. Do you really need, again, to reach unanimity to create the first battle group since it was designed as a tool? Well, I don't think so. So don't be trapped either with a unanimity discussion on the democratic deficit of removing unanimity and so on. Because for some areas, yes. For some others, more operational, it's not necessary.
Unless there are any really burning questions, yes.
I would like to only add some remarks about the unanimity question, especially in terms of common security. Most of the time, as you said, so it's a burden, it's a blockage to the act effectively, especially in terms of missions, and that's why, especially in the CSCP, they are more inclined to to create the civilian missions rather than military operations. Yeah, we can discuss about the European Union's characteristics about civilian inclined, but the unanimity is one of the burden upon the European Union's shoulder.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah. So on that note, I guess, we're really grateful for you giving up your time, for your fantastic lecture, and also for taking questions.
No,
yeah, it's really appreciated. So thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.